The first step in drawing any landscape is to put down the horizon line. This is the line where the ground meets the sky. It's always good to put it down dotted. Don't make it a hard line because you will have tree trunks and other things that go over it. So you don't want that line to show through the tree trunk. So I put down a dotted line. So this is my horizon. And now what we can do is we can place other elements like tree trunks and foliage and other things with regards to the horizon. So I put down this line. And let's start by putting down some simple tree trunks. So what I will do is I'll start by putting down one trunk here. This is almost kind of middle ground, so it's not too far and not too close. So this is middle ground. And it's always a good idea to spread around the trees so that the whole composition is interesting. So I have one in the middle ground, and let me put another trunk that is a bit further out. And what happens is that as the trunks they move out in the distance, they become smaller. So this trunk will essentially be smaller than the one that I have that is closer to the viewer, this one. So I will make it a bit smaller. Let me put down one trunk that is even closer to the viewer. So this will be even more bigger. So again, as the trunks are getting closer to the viewer, they're getting bigger, right? So I have this trunk, this is almost in the middle ground. This trunk is, this is in the foreground. This is kind of middle ground, and this is, receding further out. And I can add one more trunk that is almost also in the middle ground. And finally, I will add one more trunk that is even further out, so even smaller. So, it's almost barely any size. So this is the furthest out trunk that we have. So essentially now we have simple 5 trunks, and what now we can do is to start shading the bark texture in the trunk to bring them out. And to create the bark texture for the trunk that are not up close, for example, these 4 trunks, a simple stroke to use is this angular line. So essentially these are small lines that cut across each other like this. So this is a very simple stroke that can be used to render the bark for the trunk that are not up close. So for this trunk that is up close, we would like to show more bark detail, and I'll show you in a moment how that is done. But for these other trunks that are further out, we start by simply using these angular lines, like this, to create the bark texture. So I create a simple layer of this angular lines for this trunk. The other important thing to understand is that to bring out the roundness in a trunk, one end of the trunk should be darker than the other. So what I'm doing is I'm leaving this end lighter. So as you can see, here the lines are barely there. But what I will do is that on the other end, this end, I will start to add more angular lines. So as I'm doing it, what is happening is that this end is getting darker than the other end, and this is also bringing out the roundness of the trunk. So essentially to bring out the roundness of the trunk, what we are doing is adding these angular lines to the outline of the trunk, and then making one end, this one, darker than the other. And the last thing that you can do is to add crevices in the trunk to bring out the bark texture. And to add a crevice, add a tapered dark like this. So this, for example, when you add, indicates a crevice. Something like this, for example. Don't make it very flat, but it should be tapered. Essentially, the top a bit bigger than the bottom, or you can even do it the other way around, where the bottom and then it tapers like this. So what we can do is we can add some darks like this over here, and this kind of indicates a bit more of the crevices in the bark of the tree. The other important thing to do is to also make the edges a bit jagged. So we don't want these flat edges for the trunk and the bark, but what you can do is by adding the bit of these spots, like this darkness, it brings out the roughness of the bark and make it more believable and adds more interest to it. So this is what I will do over here. So in this simple manner, you can essentially draw a tree trunk, right? And we will use the same technique to draw the trunk for the bark for the trunk that is a bit further out. So let me use the same angular lines over here, and there we have it, right? So again, I've left this end lighter, and this end I will make it a bit more darker to again bring out the roundness of the trunk. And the same technique can be used for this trunk that is again in the middle ground. So I'll use the same angular lines, leaving one end light and one end, and making the other end darker, like this over here. And I will go ahead and again add the same, a bit of crevices and bit of, rough bark, make the edges a bit rough, which will, again make the bark texture more believable. So there we have it. So I just added a bit more of roughness to the edges of the trunk over here, and I can do the same to this one over here as well. So quickly just add some roughness to this edge, so that makes it more believable. So there we have it. So quickly we have put down the bark for the three tree trunks. For the trunk that is furthest out and is smaller in size, we don't really have that much of width to put down and create this kind of change of tone from dark to light. So essentially, when these trunks, from darker to lighter, this change of tone is what makes gives the appearance of roundness to the trunk. So for the trunk that is further out, what we do is we simply actually make one edge darker. So that's it. Since we don't really have space to bring out this kind of texturing, I simply make this one edge dark. And as you can see, what happens is that when you make one edge dark, it literally again brings out the roundness of the trunk. So by simply making one edge, and then you can again add a bit of jaggedness to make the edge a bit rough. So if you want, you can do that as well. So that completes this far out trunk. So that's the easiest, because you simply have to add a bit of darkness to one edge to bring out the form. Now for the trunk that is closest to the viewer, we need to, we want to give more bark details, because, as the trunk gets closer to the viewer, more bark is visible. So for that, create a bark outline. So essentially what I will do is I will create an outline of the bark pieces for this trunk. So essentially what we are doing is we are saying that, over here, this line, it just in a way indicates overall texture for the bark, but it's not really giving an indication of, bark details. The bark pieces are not visible using this texture. But for this trunk that is closer up, we want, that detail to be visible. So the first step for rendering more bark details is to draw this kind of, bark outline. So I am using a stroke like this, and I'm overlapping them a bit. So again, do not use something like this. Do not use that curved line, but use a little bit of roundness and unevenness at the edges to create the bark texture. And again, at the edges over here, they are smaller and they are the biggest in the center. So again, as I reach the edge, I'll make them smaller again over here. So I create this bark outline, and this bark outline suggests that more bark details are visible to the viewer when the trunk is up close. And again, you can use different shapes for this bark outline. So now I'm using a bit angular, but if you want, you can create an elongated shape as well, like this, for example. So by using different shapes for these bark pieces, you can give a very different feel for the overall texture of the bark for the tree, for the trunk that is closest to the viewer. So I simply define this bark outline, and in the next step we will shade these pieces individually. So over here, we just shaded the whole trunk, but for this close-up tree, what we will now do is to shade these pieces individually. And the way we shade it is that, again, the different strokes that you can use. One option is to use this parallel line. So essentially you simply you create this parallel lines in each piece, and again, to bring out the roundness, I will shade one end darker than the other. So again, here this is darker, this is lighter, and because of the change of tone from dark to light, you feel that this bark piece has a bit of curvature. So you want to show that roundness, that form for the bark. You don't want to make it very flat. The other option is you can simply use some marks like this, dots, and a bit of marks like these. So these marks can be used as well to create a kind of bark texture as well, right? So and again, when you're using these marks, again, make one end darker than the other. So there are different options in terms of what marks that you can use to fill the bark outline to give the actual bark texture. But here what we will do is simply use the parallel lines, right? So we'll use the parallel lines and then darken one end compared to the other. So this is what I will do. And what I'm doing actually is even not extending the lines all the way to the ends, so if you here I start and then I leave one end light. And what this does is that, again, it gives the bark a feel of roundness. So here again, I just simply use the parallel lines and leave, and I don't extend the lines all the way to the end, which results in that other end being white, and then there's a change of tone from the dark of the lines to the white of the end, and this brings out the roundness of the bark piece. So simply do the same for all the pieces, and as you can see, as you start to fill in the lines and you start to give the bark pieces the darkness and leaving the other end light, the bark pieces will start to look round. They'll start to get their form and the feel for the bark will start to come out. So that's what I'm doing all over here. So continue the same way, and try not to use two different strokes for the same tree, because that will have different effects. Essentially, you want to keep the texture for the bark uniform across in one trunk. So here I will use the same parallel strokes throughout all the bark pieces to give out that texture for the bark for this trunk. And again, it's very important to make sure that you're not fully darkening it. If you fully darken and don't leave the white edge, then the bark will not give appearance of roundness, so that the whole texture of the whole curvature of the bark is lost, and then that doesn't look that interesting or realistic. So by leaving a bit of white at the edges, you're giving a form to the bark, which really gives the drawing a lot more interest than otherwise. So I continue in this manner, and I add these lines to darken one end of the bark outline for this tree. So now, as you can see, we have this trunk up close done, and we use a different technique where we first drew the bark outline and then we darken each bark piece individually using the line and leaving the other end of the bark piece white to bring out the roundness. And this really brings out shows the bark details a lot more, and the viewer feels that that the trunk is closer because of the size, and also because of the fact that they can see more bark details. So that reinforces the feeling of the tree closer to the viewer. So now we are done with the texturing of the trunk and the bark. The next step is to create some kind of distant foliage. Landscape drawing is always more interesting when there's something at the back, where the eyes can rest. So what we will do is to create a distant tree line. And the simplest way to do this is to use these parallel lines depicting some kind of tree line at the distance. The important thing to keep in mind is that don't keep the height uniform. So I can even draw a bit of outline with the dots, which is the tree line that we will depict. And always it's interesting to end it in the corner. So this dotted line depicts the kind of tree line that I will draw using the vertical parallel lines. So this vertical parallel line is a great way to create a kind of distant tree line in any landscape drawing to add interest. So there we have it, and let me finish this end as well. And also one thing to keep in mind is that the bottom of a tree line is always darker than the top, because the bottom receives less light than the top. So what we will do is I'll go ahead and also add some more lines at the bottom to essentially darken the bottom. So I'll add some more line that kind of makes the bottom of the distant tree line a bit darker, and that makes it more believable. So there we have it. We quickly added a distant tree line, and that makes the whole sketch a bit more interesting. And the last thing that we will do in this tutorial is to cover the ground with the grass. So the ground right now doesn't really have a form. So the first thing to do is to define the ground, and the simplest way to do it is to again use the parallel lines that are small in the distance, and they get bigger as they get closer to the viewer. So with these lines we are essentially defining the ground form, and you can use a different set of lines like this. So what happens is that when you use these lines, they kind of define how the ground is. And if you want to make the ground a bit round, you can use a lines that curve like this, for example. So that defines a rounded curvature. Over here I'm just using parallel lines to indicate that the ground is flat. What I'm doing is also to reduce the size of this line. So this reinforces again the perspective, right? So the lines that are in distance are smaller and they get bigger as they get closer to the viewer. And because of this, the viewer feels that the distance, they feel the distance because the lines are changing, reducing in size with the distance, so they get smaller with the distance. So once we use these lines to define the ground form, next we can simply add the grass on this. And the way to add grass is to use a simple grass stroke. So this is a very simple grass stroke. And also, as you get out in the distance, you make the grass smaller. So in the distance I will use these very simple lines like this to add the grass, and as I get closer to the viewer, I'll make the grass bigger by making the lines a bit bigger like this. So let's add a simple grass. So over here in the distance I just add very small lines. They're not quite parallel, but they're a bit at an angle, so add the grass at an angle like this, using small lines. So I just add, and the other important thing to keep in mind is that you don't have to cover the whole ground with the grass. A big thing in pen and ink is the notion of suggestion, right? So we suggest something is out there by drawing some marks, but we don't really have to cover the whole ground with those marks. So what I will do is simply create a bit of grass here, a bit of grass there, and this brings out the overall feel of the ground being covered with the grass, but I'm not literally covering the whole ground with the grass. And again, as I get closer to the viewer, I make the strokes a bit bigger, so that indicates that the grass is getting bigger, which again is how perspective work. As things go out in the distance, they become smaller, and the same holds for the grass. So the grass that is at a distance is smaller, is visible, small to us, so we make it small. And as we come closer to the viewer, I make the grass blades a bit bigger. And as you can see again, I'm not literally covering the whole ground with the grass stroke. I'm just using a suggestion, adding a bit here, adding a bit there, and that conveys the notion of the ground covered with the grass. And once that's done, then that's where you can stop. You literally don't have to cover the whole ground. So I will again add a bit of grass to the distance over here and increase my stroke as I get closer. So by defining this ground form using these horizontal parallel lines and then adding grass, it creates a very good definition of the ground. So now the viewer can actually see the trees are standing on the ground. The shape of the ground using these lines is also understood. And then finally we add the grass to give it more interest. So there we have, I added some grass quickly. Again, it's very lightly done, but it again conveys the feeling of the ground covered with the grass. I will do the same over here. So again, by adding a bit of grass here, a bit of grass there, you convey the feeling of the ground is covered with the grass. The final thing is to ground the trees. So essentially, we have this tree trunk, but still, we haven't really done anything at the base. And the easiest way to ground a trunk is to darken it by adding, a bit more grass over here. So what I'm doing for this trunk is to then add this grass in a very small, dense manner. So essentially, what you do is you bring out these strokes closer. You make the strokes closer like this, and this helps to kind of, give an impression of dense grass, which grounds the trunk. So I'll just do it like this. And also to make it more interesting, I taper, this is the shape I defined for the grounding of the trunk, right? I'm not making it straight, but that adds a bit of interest. So there you have it. Once you add that kind of bit of you darken the ground by adding a bit more grass stroke, it gives the feeling of the ground, being covered with grass, with dense grass, and also grounds the trunk over here. So I will do the same over here. Just use a small grass stroke to ground this trunk as well. And as you can see, grounding the trunk really brings out the drawing. So if you leave a trunk like this, it's just not clear as to know where the end of the trunk is, or it just looks incomplete. So just by adding a bit of this grass stroke, I'm able to ground the trunk and make the drawing much more interesting. So I do the same over here for this trunk, far out trunk as well. And then finally for the close-up trunk, I will use a bit bigger grass strokes to ground it. So again, like I said, the size of the grass stroke should be in relation to where that grass is in relation to the viewer, right? So for the far out grass, we literally almost use like dots, something like this, for example, very small. But as you get closer to the viewer, I'm using bigger strokes for the grass because the grass, seen bigger as it's closer to the viewer. And I again, keep adding more grass till it starts to get darker. And when it starts to get darker, then the trunk starts to look grounded. So there we have it. I simply grounded this trunk by adding more grass over here. And I will do the same for this trunk here as well. So there we have it, just by adding more of this grass, it looks grounded. So this is essentially a very quick drawing. What we did is to lay down the horizon line, create these 5 trunks at different distance so that it adds interest to the drawing. This is in the middle ground, this is foreground, and these 3 are further out. And for the trees that are in the middle distance, we use these kind of angular lines. These are not parallel, overlapping angular lines to define the bark texture. And we also make one end darker than the other to bring out the roundness. And what happens with these lines is that when you see there's a white space that is left between the lines, here, it gives a feel for bark texture. And the change in tone from the dark to the light, it brings out the roundness. So that's what we did with these 3 trunks. For the far out trunk, we simply make one end darker. And that kind of, enforces the notion of roundness and gives it a feel for trunk. And for the close-up tree, we created a bark outline like this. And then we essentially shaded each bark outline, and we again made one end of the outline darker than the other to bring out the roundness like this. So this is how we did it. This end is darker than the other, and the white that is left at the edges, it gives a feel of roundness and gives a feel for the bark rather than some flat thing. So that's how we did the texturing for the bark of these trunks. And then we added a bit of distant tree line by simply adding vertical lines. So this is a very simple way to add or suggest a distant tree line. And you can also darken it. If you want, you can darken it, and always darken the bottom a bit more than the top, because the bottom of a tree line receives less light and is darker. So I can actually even darken it a bit more. And also make sure that your distant tree line is in the form of how it's in the nature, something like this. Don't make it flat. There's always a kind of a flow to the tree line. And then again I do it like this, and so that that created the distant tree line. And then finally we added these horizontal lines to define the form for the ground. And again, when you do this, always make the lines in the distance smaller than the one closer. So this also gives a feel for distance, the perspective to the viewer. And at the end we added grass. So for the distant grass, we use these very small strokes like this over here. And for the close-up grass, we use a bigger strokes to suggest the bigger size for the grass. And finally, we grounded the trees by just adding a bit of height, bit of density of grass. So just by adding more grass, these trunks, they look grounded. And this essentially completes the sketch or a quick drawing, that you can enjoy doing anytime in under 20 minutes. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.